Hey folks, it's February the 26th, and today we're going to discuss more of the Civil Rights Movement and the Cold War, and possibly get into the U.S. entry into Vietnam. And just as a reminder, grades are all due next week, next Friday. And so then you're going to have your next report card, and it's frozen. There's nothing we can do after that. So make sure you get your grades all in. If you're missing something, just go ahead and turn it in. You'll have some points taken off for a late grade, but that's about it. But yeah, next week's an A week, so we're only going to meet Tuesday and Thursday. So, all right. So last time we ended we ended at the point where JFK, President Kennedy, was assassinated, and his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, became president. We talked a bit about some of the things that he did in his Great Society, in which he wanted to expand social programs to help out people who were impoverished, perhaps held down, either due to things like the old Jim Crow system, inequalities, and things like that. And so this is a massive growth in the powers and the scope of the federal government in day-to-day lives. But just because you had this intention going on, this well-intended policies, doesn't mean that the nation was doing all that great. So this is a time period when, though there was a lot of success from the civil rights movement as far as peaceful demonstrations and marches and things like that, a lot of this will take a turn towards violence across the nation. And so we're going to have demonstrations become riots, which was a pretty big deal back then. So America divided under Johnson. In many parts of America, people became disenchanted with nonviolent strategy to the civil rights movement. Remember, that's what Martin Luther King advocated, turning the other cheek, showing that you're on the side of righteousness, not violence, right? Well, a lot of people were like, that's not fast enough. So you're going to have essentially race riots are going to start breaking out in places like Los Angeles, which had the Watts riot in 1965, another riot in Detroit in 1967. These were stark examples, and up to 300 plus would occur across the cities across the nation. So the late 60s had a lot of these riots that were racially motivated. Sometimes it would be angry groups of white people who would go to black neighborhoods and like burn down people's homes and stuff like that. Sometimes it would be the other way around, where it'd be angry groups of African Americans who were really upset that they didn't have more rights. And so they would burn down businesses and things like that. The police would usually respond very violently, and this made it on national television. So a lot of people were watching TV and they felt the country was falling apart. Though Martin Luther King won a Nobel Peace Prize for all of his efforts, he was shouted down after the riots for not going far enough. So a lot of other civil rights leaders were like, yeah, you have a Nobel Peace Prize. You brought a lot of attention to the movement, but a lot of people were really calling for him to start calling for something that was a bit more revolutionary. This is going to lead to an offshoot of the civil rights movement called the Black Power movement. And they're going to be signified by groups like the Black Panthers that actually started out as a street gang that was known for selling drugs, but would eventually move on to doing things like police assassination, acts of violence, things like trying to like beating people up if they didn't vote the right way, things like that. You would also have the rise of something called the Nation of Islam. Now, the Nation of Islam is very different from what you might think of as Islam. It's like a branch off of normal Islam, I guess you'd say, where they have a lot of ideas on racial superiority. You could call it like reverse racism. They believed that people of African descent were the most superior humans, and that I don't know, it's kind of strange in that, but they did call for nonviolence. Um, they called for isolationism and essentially preparedness and separation from what they considered white society. Martin Luther King continued to call for reform and nonviolence despite all this, but unfortunately, he was assassinated on April the 4th, 1968. And so he's going to be a martyr for the cause. And he's going to find that as he does things, like he goes up to places like Chicago and Detroit, if I remember correctly, he's going to find that though the laws were not there, like in the Jim Crow South, that would hold down Black people, he found that the counter demonstrations up north, the Northerners were actually much more violent whenever he went up and demonstrated up north. So he'd go up north, and yeah, like they weren't breaking any laws and they weren't afraid of going to jail, but they would find that the counter protesters were doing things like wearing Nazi uniforms and stuff like that. And they were truly scared. They're like, what's going on here? So it goes to show this wasn't just a Southern thing. It's like what I talked about earlier. You had legal racism, and then you had like implicit, like it's implied racism. You know, it's like there, but it's not on the law books. So came across that. Let's go to the next one. All right, so like I told you, a lot of what's going to happen with civil rights is going to come from the federal government. During this time period, you're going to have all three branches on board. Though a lot of the states didn't want to get involved into it, and a lot of the voters didn't. You will see that this will come down from above. This is what's known as the Warren Court, named after its Chief Justice. Whenever you have a Supreme Court, you know, we have 9 justices, and one of them is considered kind of like the leader, right? They help propose what cases they're going to look at, laws, and things like that. So, a changing America. The 60s emerged as a time of great change and counterculture for many Americans. So, a lot of people, especially young folks, really wanted the face of America to change. They saw it as very restrictive, especially against certain groups of people. And so they thought, well, if that part's bad, then maybe more of it's bad. And you're going to see during the 60s, you're going to see an increase of like drug use, right, and experimentation. You're going to see also the rise of divorce. So this is when states are going to start adopting what we call no-fault divorce. Most states, of course, they had divorce, but you had to prove that, like one spouse had to prove that the other was insane or abusive or something like that. With no-fault divorce, both parties can just agree to divorce and it happens. So you're going to see a rise in that. You're going to see people are going to start doing things like hooking up out of wedlock and things like that. You're going to see the rise of the hippie movement, rock and roll, stuff like that. So there's going to be a lot more acceptance of things that are kind of really against like capitalist values. So you're going to see people start espousing socialism. You're going to, especially in universities, you know, people talk about moving outside of the normal family structure. The things, you know, like fashion, everything being challenged, right? But unfortunately, you're also going to see the rise of overdoses from drugs and sexually transmitted diseases. So you get one, you get the other. In the 1960s, it was also defined by the Supreme Court rulings under the Warren Court named after the Chief Justice at the time, as we mentioned. The Warren Court viewed the Constitution as it applied to modern times, not according to why it was written. So you would call this like a living document approach to it, not a constructionist approach. And so, living document approach to the Constitution means the meaning of the terms are how you want to apply it to how you need it then, not necessarily how the founders intended. Whereas constructionist is very literal and according to what the historical answer was. This court banned religion in schools, freed communist prisoners, because remember, if you were a communist, you went to prison, legalized pornography, and made other sweeping changes. So what they did is a lot of things that were against standard American social norms, the Warren Court legalized. So you're going to see that. Let me see. Yeah. So a lot of these things are going to come in that we see around us today. Like, you ready? Okay. So surprise, surprise, changes happened in the 60s. I think everybody's ever watched the movie knows that. But also during the 60s, there was some other stuff going on too, as you see this picture, Vietnam. So here we have some soldiers getting off of a helicopter, a Huey, and all right, so the Vietnam War. Like Kennedy, President Johnson faced a crisis in Vietnam as the Viet Cong, that was the communist forces, were winning. So if you remember, we had a big problem in Korea because the people that we chose to support were losing and the communists were taking over. Well, the same thing was happening in Vietnam. The non-communist government that we supported was gradually losing. But the Viet Cong here is taking over. They're moving, once again, from the north to the south. Johnson believed that the U.S. must get involved. Even though we were involved in part under Kennedy, he wants to really up it up into a full-fledged war. And so he began what we call covert raids. So covert raids essentially are whenever you're using attacks that are specific towards a target, but you're trying to not use all-out warfare. So they might do this in tandem with like our spy networks with the CIA. And they're using the newly formed like Green Berets and of course the Navy SEALs to do a lot of this as well. He also wanted to help them out with strategic planning and public campaigns. In August of 1964, North Vietnamese boats attacked an American destroyer. Days later, Congress approved what was known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave the president the ability to use any military means possible in the region. So we didn't declare war. We just told the president, hey, whatever you need, go send it down there. So March of 1964, we start with Operation Rolling Thunder. This is when we sent soldiers and Marines to arrive at Da Nang. So that's the beginning of the Vietnam War, essentially. In July that year, U.S. planes flew more than 900 combat missions a week, and around 100,000 troops entered Vietnam. And so the Vietnamese forces at first during this war, they tried to fight American forces like a standard military. Same things happened in recent wars too, Iraq and Afghanistan. Try to fight our forces going on like face to face, totally whooped them. So then they went underground and started fighting as like guerrilla fighters. And that's where it really got ugly for us. Standard militaries have a very hard time fighting guerrilla fighters. They're entrenched with the people. They only attack whenever they have an advantage. It's pretty tough stuff. And this is going to be a super expensive war too. We're just dumping just so many bombs and fighter jets and bombers and keeping those up in the air. Amount of food and supplies and things like that. This is going to be a very expensive endeavor. And not to mention human lives. We're going to institute the draft. And a lot of young men from America, without their consent, are going to be forced to go into Vietnam to fight a war that a lot of people couldn't really figure out why we were there. So this is going to help add to that counterculture mindset in America, where people are going to be very mad about the way things are going. They're mad about some cultural things. They're mad about civil rights things, and now they're mad about, well, why are we doing this war stuff? So it's going to really split America apart. Yeah.
Why were we doing the war things?
Why were we doing the war things? Oh man, it's all right. So if you want the cynical answer, it's because people are making money off of it. But a lot of it had to do with domino theory. And so that was the idea that if communism spreads in one place, it'll be like an infection that spreads in others, and eventually it will hurt us. So you got to keep it contained. And so,
Vietnam.
yeah, so somehow Vietnam on the other side of the world, we believe that it could spread and start hurting other areas. But I mean, part of it was too, we were like our Navy is all throughout the world all the time doing things like trying to put down pirates, keep shipping lanes open and stuff. We purposefully put our boats there outside of Vietnam to monitor things. And of course, when one was attacked, that kind of gave us, well, you shot first. And that's one thing that nations often do when they want to justify war is you want the other guy to strike first, so it's moral. And so sometimes you might kind of goad them into making that first strike. So we might have done that here. But yeah, I mean, a lot of it was kind of like same with Korea. We wanted to stop communism from spreading. Thing is, back home in America, a lot of people were like, well, what do I care if people are communist way over there? You know, so I don't know. All right, let's go to one more for the day. So continuing on Vietnam, I don't remember if these were early Navy SEALs or if these were Green Berets. I don't remember. In any case, these were not normal troops. You see, they also had like Vietnamese translators and fighters with them, wearing non-standard stuff. Yeah, they look like something out of a cheesy movie. Yeah. The Vietnam War. But I'm sure those guys were like stacking bodies like crazy. So following General William Westmoreland's recommendation. So William Westmoreland was the guy who was he was the lead general for our side in Vietnam. And so he made recommendations to the president, of course, the commander in chief, who agreed to send more troops in order to overwhelm the enemy. So in order to get more troops, though, he had to increase the draft. And they did the draft based off of a lottery. So you would watch TV to see if you're I think it was alphabetized or it was based on your birthday. And if your birthday came up, you had to go to the recruiter's office and they would tell you you would have to do your best you could to try to get one branch or another. A lot of people volunteered just so they could have a choice in what they did in the military. In November of 1965, the first major U.S. offensive occurred at La Drang Valley. So an offensive is when you are just really trying to push through, take territory, destroy the enemy. And they were hoping that if we could take territory, we could eventually control it and push out the Viet Cong. The American forces were vastly outnumbered in 3 days battle as both sides claimed victory, despite the lopsided death toll. 305 Americans to 3,000 and a half Vietnamese. But that was the thing about the Vietnamese. Just like the Chinese in the Korean War, they didn't care how many people they lost. They figured as long as they could draw this out, Americans would regret the war and eventually pull out. And it worked. It's one of the tactics you use in a guerrilla war. Is you wear down your enemy until they just finally go away. The U.S. emerged with a strategy to grind down the enemy through seek and destroy missions. And so essentially this is when you send troops out into sectors looking for the enemy. And when you fix them in position, usually, I don't know, if you have a firefight, you try to call in artillery or air support. While the North Vietnamese wanted to wait out the Americans until they lost hope. Like we said, they were trying to wait us out. We were trying to find them. was like a game of cat and mouse. And so, for U.S. troops, a lot like what you might think of in Iraq. In Iraq, yeah, it was guerrilla warfare, but it was more desert and city based. And so, U.S. troops were going out trying to find the underground forces, and they would ambush or set up booby traps. Same thing in Vietnam. They knew the place, they had the people on their side. They would set up ambushes, set up booby traps. And so as the soldiers are going around looking for the enemy, they're getting killed by things and people they can't even see. So very scary stuff, very scary stuff. All right, folks, that's going to end our lecture today. We're going to pick back up on Tuesday with more of the Vietnam War. And then we're going to come on to Nixon. And then we'll see after that. See you later.
What kind of blessing is that? Westmoreland.
Westmoreland. Yeah, that's